Film and Whiskey Nation, do you ever think about awards? Of course you do. You drink whiskey and watch movies, which means that you know that nothing is validated until a group of random people say, hey, we love what you're doing. The awesome thing about Doc Swinson's whiskey is that it isn't just some group of schlubs that are giving them awards. They have been winning attention from some of the most important whiskey experts that you can imagine. They've been voted best distillery in Washington State by the New York International Spirits Competition. They've been voted the best independent bottler by the Ascot Awards, as well as the best finished bourbon from the Ascot Awards for their La Menta Exploratory Cask. Their Exploratory Cask series is where they release some of the most fascinating and adventurous experiments. If you're ever checking out Doc's lineup and see a white label, there's a really good chance that that's the only time you'll see that bottle, so make sure you snatch it up. Doc Swinson's has been offering just phenomenal finished and blended whiskeys for quite some time now. You can find them online at docswhiskey.com. That's DOCS whiskey.com. In 1957, director David Lean and star Sir Alec Guinness gave the world a lengthy examination of the dangers of British honor.
In 2022, we try a supposed whiskey that may or may not have any honor.
The film is The Bridge on the River Kwai.
The whiskey is Jameson Cold Brew.
And we'll review them both. This is
the Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we are continuing our mini-series from the director David Lean with his 1957 Best Picture-winning epic, The Bridge on the River Kwai.
Would you call this an epic?
Yeah, I was just going to say, coming off of Lawrence of Arabia, where that movie, I think, truly encapsulates the word epic, this feels like a straight popcorn movie. And yet, it's really not. I think it kind of straddles the line between Lawrence of Arabia and, like, The Great Escape. I kept thinking of The Great Escape as we watched this movie. And this is a much more artfully made film than The Great Escape. I think there's very clearly, like, so much more thought and effort put into each and every shot in this movie. It's every bit as beautiful as Lawrence of Arabia, without being as ponderous. I don't mean that in like to say Lawrence of Arabia was boring, but Lawrence of Arabia gave itself lots of time to breathe, whereas this movie is like almost as tightly constructed as it could be. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, really, if he wanted to make this more like Lawrence of Arabia, he just needed about an hour of extra footage of them like traipsing through the jungle.
Yeah.
And that would have captured the essence of Lawrence a little more deeply, I think. There needed to be camels.
They're like floating down the river when they were like setting the charges at the end. They just needed to be floating on the backs of camels instead of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're going to be comparing this movie to Lawrence a lot today because, I mean, obviously it's the movie that we just came off of. It is David Lean's most famous movie. And this one, I think, kind of gets the shaft a little bit, if I'm being honest, because everyone fawns over Lawrence of Arabia, and this movie is seen as not as, I don't know what the word is, not as artistic. You know what I mean? Like, this is a movie, and Lawrence of Arabia is a film. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I don't know how to explain the difference between the two, but I understand where people are coming from, but I also think that really glosses over just what an artistic achievement this movie is.
Yeah, Scorsese would be fawning over Lawrence over Bridge, I'm sure.
All right, man. Well, why don't we jump right into Brad Explains? This is the part of the podcast where Brad breaks down the film that he has just seen, often for the first time. We want to say if you are a first-time listener to the podcast, welcome in. We haven't really explained the premise of the show in a while, Brad. This thing started because I'm a huge movie nerd, and Brad is one of my best friends. And we fell in love with whiskey when we were both living in Kentucky, and we found that as we drank more whiskey, it became much more fun to discuss movies. And over the course of many, many whiskeys, we discovered that Brad had not seen a ton of classic movies, or movies that at least I had deemed classic movies. That's an important distinction. So we started off with a list that I made of about 150 movies that I thought Brad should see. I still don't think
the list was like 400.
I was going to say, I still don't think we've gotten through all those movies because we've been inserting other things that we wanted to watch. And I finally let Brad pick a couple movies for some reason. But here we are today, arriving at the bridge on the River Kwai. Brad, had you seen this movie prior to this watch through?
I was going to say, this was a classic that I had seen, Robert. I remember watching this as probably a young teenager, like 13, 14 years old, with my dad at some point. Mm-hmm. And I was so excited to watch this again. And there's a lot of films I saw in that time, in my age period of, 13 to 16, that I don't really remember that well. This is one that I was like, I feel like I remember a lot of this movie, but I could be wrong. And I wasn't. They went to put him in the hot box, and I vividly remember the officers straining to look out and see what the medical officer was talking to Alec Guinness about. And I vividly remember the characters going to blow up the bridge and them looking up through the trusses of the bridge at the Japanese guards. And there's so many shots from this movie that are just gorgeous and stuck with me, even, having not seen the movie in almost 20 years.
Well, that's really exciting, and I have things to say, but I don't want to step all over Brad Explains here. So as we get into Brad Explains, we're putting 60 seconds on the clock for you to break down the plot of this movie. Brad, you have 1 minute, and go.
British prisoners of war during World War II are forced to build a bridge, a railway bridge over the River Kwai by their Japanese captors. They find themselves in a little bit of trouble when the Colonel Saito, forces the officers to work, breaking the Geneva Convention. However, they have a British officer named Nicholson who stands up for them and refuses to allow his officers to work. Eventually, he has his way and goes about building the best daggone bridge that the Japanese have ever seen. Unbeknownst to him, one of the prisoners who escaped is recruited by British Special Services to blow up the bridge that they just completed.
There you go. And suspense ensues.
Yeah, dude, the final sequence.
Oh my gosh. It's so tense.
Oh my. And he does such a great job of setting up the geography of the one guy's going to stay up top and he's got a mortar and the other three are going to go down and set the charges and set them underwater so nobody sees them. And then he's going to be over there on this side of the river and you're going to be over by those trees. And he just does such an excellent job of showing you this is the stage upon which I will, pull your emotional heartstrings. And then he does it, man. It's terrifyingly suspenseful.
Yeah, man, this movie is really tense, really suspenseful, and it's just a masterful job by David Lean. I want to go back to what you were saying a minute ago, just about watching this movie as a kid and this being a classic in your household. I feel like in 2022, this movie occupies a really interesting space where it has a ton of reviews on IMDb. If you go look at how many people have rated it, it's really up there. And so it kind of seems like this is a film that everyone has seen at some point. I know that it definitely has the vibe of one of those Saturday afternoon, right after a John Wayne movie completes on AMC, they're going to throw this on and it's 18 hours long with commercials. And so it feels like tons of people have seen this movie, and yet I never hear anybody talk about it anymore because maybe it's just gotten to the age now where it's not top of mind when people talk about war movies or action suspense films. And it's also not considered a quote unquote artistic film to the extent that Lawrence of Arabia is. And so it also doesn't get discussed enough in film circles. And I feel like for being a movie that everyone appears to have seen, this doesn't have a lot of traction anymore. So I don't really know how to approach it today, Brad. Do you think that a sizable portion of our audience has seen this movie, or do you think we're probably talking to a lot of people who have never seen it?
Oh, man. I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I feel like It's a movie that people have probably seen, but they haven't really just sat down to watch it. Like, I think that a lot of people are in the category where you said, like, yeah, it was on the TV, so I kind of, like, skimmed it while I was doing other stuff, but I don't know if I sat down and watched the whole thing. And I will say, this is a movie that rewards paying attention to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's not a difficult movie to understand. And I honestly, like, when I turned it on, I remember it being a long movie. And so I saw 2 hours and 40-something minutes, and I was like, all right, I'm going to strap myself in. It's a full hour shorter than Lawrence of Arabia, so it felt like a breeze.
It really did feel so much better, dude.
But I have to say, like, even though I think this movie probably could have shed a few scenes and been even tighter than it is, it never felt super long to me. Like, it didn't really drag at any point. And by the time it got to the end, I thought, like, yeah, I totally get why it was 2 hours and 41 minutes or whatever the runtime is. It didn't feel overlong. It didn't feel bloated. And I think it's a credit to David Lean and to the editing of this film, just how much it moves.
Yeah, the pacing of this film is really incredible, especially when you consider how long it is. Like, you hit over 2.5 hours and you're getting into serious movie territory, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to consider that there's no moment of this film that really feels like it's dragging. I do think that if they cut maybe, I think I said to you earlier, like 8 to 12 minutes, like not even like 15, 20, 25 minutes, like just about 10 minutes from the film, just a few little pieces here and there, I think this might be a perfect film. But as it is, the action keeps you rolling. And the beautiful thing about the film is it's not typical war movie action. It's not The Great Escape. They're trying to hide their tunnels from the German guards. Like, it's the tension between the different viewpoints of the Japanese, of the British, of the alternating British sides that you feel completely engulfed in this conflict between, like, do we do things well with honor or do we seditiously try to sabotage the enemy? And I just think it's incredible.
Well, and I think the brilliance of this movie is that the place that it ultimately arrives at is that these things that seem to be opposed to each other ultimately lead to the exact same fate or the same end. You know, there's this word that, Brad, you and I learned in college and in seminary from the Greek. The word is telos. And it's like, what is the end of something? What is the goal towards which it's pointing, right? What's the result of it? And this, like, you know, the last lines of this movie are this British medic who has been questioning Alec Guinness's motives the whole movie. And then he sees the carnage that's been, you know, wrought and just looks around and says, madness, madness. And that's the last line of the movie. And it really does a great job of portraying these characters who you understand all of their motivations, and yet they don't understand themselves that regardless of the fact that they come from diametrically opposed ideologies and viewpoints, that it all ultimately leads to the exact same telos. Like, it leads to the same place, which is like, what was this all for? Everyone's dead. Like, we tried to build this thing with honor and it's been blown up. We tried to blow this thing up. And in doing so, we lost sight of the value of human life. Like, what is the point of all of this? I think ultimately it is an anti-war movie, and we'll get into talking about this a little bit more, but last week, I also talked about how I think that David Lean was really interrogating the idea of British propriety with Lawrence of Arabia, and he definitely does so again here with this movie.
Well, and the fascinating thing to me is we might not be used to this in 2022 America, nearly 2023, Bob. Oh, that's crazy.
We're almost there.
He uses an American to point out the flaws in the system the whole way. I mean, I think he does it with the British medic as well, but William Holden's character is the only one who truly, the entire movie is like, you guys are all crazy. Like, there's no point to this. I'm in this to save my own skin. And, you know, he kind of gains a semblance of honor at the end and trying to accomplish the mission. But it's interesting to me that Lean uses a American character to kind of question the whole system throughout the film.
So I was looking after I watched the film for a good review that I thought would capture my thoughts on what the themes of this movie are. And I found a really good one. And in this review, they talk about how there are 3 characters who all kind of suffer from these delusions. I don't want to say delusions of grandeur, but they call them the 3 madmen of the film. And the first one is Colonel Saito, who runs the prisoner of war camp. And he is, I guess, the most nakedly, obviously deranged of the 3 in his like torturous practices at the camp. And also in how inwardly tortured he is about the concepts, you know, in Japan of saving face and living in an honor and shame culture and trying to get something accomplished and realizing that you can't. And even though the bridge gets built, he is like utterly ruined as a man because he didn't accomplish it. And so he has more shame about it, even though the thing he wanted to have done gets done. The second person that they call one of the 3 madmen is Alec Guinness's character of Nicholson, who I think is the most interesting character in the whole movie. And we'll get into performances here in just a second, but you know, Guinness wins an Oscar for this movie, and I think it's absolutely deserved. He is just phenomenal in this movie. And I think the majority of our time today talking about the intricacies of this movie are going to revolve around his character because it is just by far the most interesting one to parse out. But the third one is this guy Hawkins, who comes in kind of in the second half of the movie, and he's the one that leads this like special forces team back into the jungle to blow up the bridge. And Hawkins, you know, I didn't think of at first as a madman, but the more you watch the movie, the more you start to parse out these themes, the more you realize that he is as deranged about what his objectives are as Alec Guinness's character is. Like he gets to the point where at the end of the movie, when he thinks that William Holden's character and the young kid that's going to blow the bridge up might end up getting captured, he decides to just take them all out with a mortar instead. And his justification for it at the end of the movie is to turn around to the people who are up there with him and who are horrified at what he just did by killing his own men and saying like, I had to do it. Don't you understand? They could have gotten taken alive. And he doesn't understand that he just used the word alive. Like, it's worse for him to give up and to be captured than to actually physically kill these people. And again, like, it just ultimately all points back to the futility of everything they're trying to do in this movie.
Yeah, and the fascinating thing is that he's pointing out how Japan and Britain are both honor-shame cultures. That both of these cultures place honor on such a pedestal that it costs them everything in the end. It costs them their lives and their dignity. And the only people that really hold on to it are the people who question it and make their own choices on what they think is right in the world rather than allowing a system to define what is good or evil for them.
I just realized that I was calling that character Hawkins the whole time. His name's Warden, but he's played by Jack Hawkins. And so to cover up my own faux pas, Brad, let's jump into performances. And let's start with Jack Hawkins because he's at the top of mind now. Now, he would not normally be the first person that I would talk about in performances because he's like the fourth lead of the movie. But I thought he did a pretty good job in this movie. I think my biggest frustration with his character is kind of like what his character represents, because once William Holden's character stages this escape from the prisoner of war camp and ends up at this sort of like special forces training camp / utopia that Warden's character runs, I think the movie goes off track for quite a long time. And it's because, first of all, I really like Jack Hawkins in this movie. I really like William Holden in this movie. William Holden is a movie star, but I don't know if he's a great actor. And the best acting that's happening in this movie is happening inside the prisoner of war camp with Alec Guinness. And I wanted to spend so much more time trying to figure out Alec Guinness's psyche that the more time I had to watch William Holden and Jack Hawkins in a room talking about stuff, the more I started to get impatient with the movie.
Yeah, it almost felt like a Christopher Nolan movie trying to explain time travel. Like they're literally just sitting there talking about this plan and why they have to do it, and Holden's explaining how he got to be where he is, and well, you see, we're in quite a delicate little pickle here, Shears, and we need you to do this for us, and it just goes on and on and on. And I would agree with you. That is the one point of this movie where they either could have trimmed it up a little bit, cut a few scenes, or they could have just cut back to what was going on in the prisoner of war camp to pace that section a little better. But it really feels like in this, 2 hour and 45-minute movie, you spend almost like 30 minutes in the middle of the film completely away from the action, if you will. Mm-hmm. And it really bogged down the middle section of this movie.
Well, especially because the first hour and 15 minutes of the movie are this psychological battle of wills between Alec Guinness's character and Saito. And, culminating in Saito finally capitulating and saying, all right, we're not going to make the officers work. And everybody cheers and Alec Guinness gets to come out of the hot box. And then, almost immediately they stage this outbreak or breakout, I guess I should say, not outbreak. But, they break out and then some guys are killed. They regroup a little bit and then boom, you're out of the prisoner of war camp and you're in the jungle and eventually on a beach with William Holden now. And it becomes a movie about a movie star. And it feels much more Hollywood. And that's not to say that this doesn't have Hollywood all over it, this movie, but it felt like I was watching, the beach makeout scene from Here to Eternity, or it felt like I had been plopped into a more kind of rah-rah, don't take it as seriously American picture and not the British psychological battle of wills in a prisoner of war camp that I've been watching for 75 minutes.
Well, and that kind of takes us into Holden a little bit more. You already tipped your hand a little bit, Bob, by saying he's a movie star, not an actor, which isn't a rude thing to say about anybody, but I'm sure he won't mind. What do you think about Holden's performance in this film?
I mean, I didn't say he's not an actor. I just don't know if he is as good of an actor as Alec Guinness, which is not, an insult. So this is, I believe, only our second William Holden movie on the podcast. We will have more, especially if we get around to movies like Sunset Boulevard. But the movie that I think is most akin to this is a movie he made a few years before called Stalag 17. It was a Billy Wilder movie. It's a great movie, but it's also a prisoner of war movie. And William Holden is the hero in that movie. And, I don't know how else to say it, Brad. He is kind of the epitome of, he is a movie star. He's a guy that is made to have a grovelly voice and probably drinks a little too much off screen and has a hell of a tan and has his shirt off all the time. And that's what he does. You know what I mean? And then you've got Alec Guinness, who's over here freaking Olivier, just acting his ass off. And I think that the difference between the two is so stark. And, it works really well to balance the movie out. But the problem is that there isn't that sort of interplay between them or even an intercutting between their scenes, to your point. It's just very much you get airlifted out of the POW camp and put into William Holden's story where he's just canoodling on a beach for a half hour. And I think to that extent, it just didn't work for me.
It still fascinates me, though. This is kind of an aside, to look at the body type of famous hot movie stars from the 50s and now what they ask their actors to do. When I think about the transformation of Chris Pratt from Andy Dwyer to Star-Lord, I'm it's wild what people have to do to be a movie star nowadays compared to the Humphrey Bogarts, Gregory Pecks, and William Holdens of the world.
So here's my biggest thing with William Holden is that he's always asked in most of his very famous movies, at least, to give some sort of grandstanding speech or monologue where he is the moral compass of the movie. And we saw
kind
it
in the end of Grapes of Wrath type of thing.
Kind of, or the end of Network, right? Which he was in, where he looks directly at Faye Dunaway and gives this whole speech about how she is the embodiment of television and then walks out.
Dude, how good of a movie is
Network? Is so good. But even then, with William Holden, he's the kind of guy where it's kind of like what we talked about with Sorkin and Demi Moore. You know what I mean? Where it's you're a really good conduit for me to hear a human being say Aaron Sorkin's words, but I don't believe what you're saying.
Yeah.
With William Holden, it just always seems like you are delivering a line that you memorized, but it never feels authentic.
Yeah, it doesn't always feel like lived in. Like I'm thinking about some of the things I've seen about Robert De Niro in some of his early films.
Okay.
And the way that directors talked about him was like when he was on set acting, like he just embodied the character, that he truly was living in their shoes. And I just don't always get that feel with William Holden. And he gives a good performance, and he is what they need him to be, but he's just too much of a distraction from the things that we really want to sit with in this movie.
Well, and I think that's a really good segue into talking about Alec Guinness. And I have been terrified for the last 2 weeks that I'm going to slip up and say Alec Baldwin. And so I need you to...
Pretty much the same actor.
You know, they're like exactly the same. I'm really glad that we have done this miniseries because Alec Guinness has been in a number of classic British films, which we may or may not ever get around to watching, but movies like The Lavender Hill Mob and Kind Hearts and Coronets and, you know, like movies that are famous in Britain that Americans have never heard of. But at this point, he was already like one of the most revered actors in Britain. And we had only discussed him in the context of Obi-Wan Kenobi. And I'm really, really glad that we're doing something with him that is outside of the realm of Star Wars because he is such a compelling actor. And I will say, like, between last week and Lawrence of Arabia, where I thought he gave maybe the best performance outside of Omar Sharif, to this movie where he is hands down the best performance in the movie, it's really been a joy to revisit a couple films with Alec Guinness in a major role.
He's incredible, Bob.
Yeah.
Like, there's just that, I don't know if it's a trope or something that people just say of like, British actors are better because they're, you know, classically trained or theater trained, if you will. And I feel like I hear that often enough, but in an actor like Alec Guinness, it makes sense. The way he comports himself with such dignity, regardless of the situation, the way he delivers his lines with such assuredness and sincerity. Some of my favorite scenes of the movie are when he is talking to the medic who's constantly questioning him. And the way he shuts down the medic with just so much self-righteousness and like he knows what is right, and he's like, oh well, you haven't been in the army long enough, you don't understand how these things work, like war is more than just these one things, and we need to build this for the local community. And yet at the end of the movie, when he's delivering that speech about wondering if his life has actually meant anything and if he's been able to have a meaningful impact on the world around him, you understand why he's doing what he's doing. He's no longer acting as a British officer. He's acting as an individual who wants to be a somebody in the world. And at the very last moment, he realizes, like, what the heck did I do? Like, I completely lost sight of everything. And that moment of realization is just everything.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a layered character, too. And I think that's what's really great about it. And apparently, you know, David Lean and Alec Guinness did not get along on the set of this movie because David Lean wanted him to be much more expressive in his performance and kind of blow up at certain points at people. And Alec Guinness basically said, A, that's not how I act. And B, I'm not going to do that. And they fought a lot about it. And Alec Guinness was right because he plays the sort of like cool and calm, and yet he is completely delusional. And I think that makes for an even more compelling delusional character because he's not coming across as a madman. He's not coming across as someone who has lost his mind. And whether or not he's lost his mind, I think, is up for debate. But I think in his own mind, he's very logical about like, hey, we're going to be here anyway. We're going to be forced to build this bridge. We might as well do it the British way. We might as well say, hey, regardless of the circumstances, we do not half-ass anything because that's not what Britons do. And when people cross this bridge 600 years from now, they're going to say, damn it, the Britons built that. And we like, you know what I mean? And you kind of understand where he's coming from, and completely ignoring the fact that at the end of the day, he is aiding and abetting the enemy, and they are going to use that aid to kill more of his countrymen. And, you know, like the logic and the honor side of him outweighs I kind of wanted to say the logic outweighs the logic, if that makes sense. But like,
Yeah.
it outweighs common sense. And so I love that he plays it not as somebody who has lost his grip on reality so much as he has become deluded with his own impressions of propriety and what the proper thing to do is.
Well, I mean, it's a misordered affection, right? Like he is desiring a set of outcomes that does not line up with his job, with his profession, with being a part of the British Army. And yet that's the beautiful part of his performance, is his ability to calmly communicate his point of view, even as we, the audience, played by the medical officer mostly, are scratching our chins going like, well, I can't disagree with your calm logic, but it doesn't feel right. And it feels fishy to me. But I'm not going to question you because you're in charge here. And oh man, it's just such a great performance.
Well, and it's one of those movies where once you finish it and you understand like the root cause of his delusions and what it all leads to, you go back and watch it again, and it's all there right from the beginning. Like him digging his heels in about not making British officers work is like, well, I don't mean to question you, my good man, but the Geneva Convention, if you need a copy provided, I have a copy right here. And he's like doing this like very high society level of negotiation. And ultimately, like, he gets out of the hot box and he wins his battle of wills and the men all cheer for him. But then you come to think about, was that actually a good move on the part of someone who's a commanding officer, that you dug your heels in and made your men have to work twice as hard because you were being stubborn about the Geneva Convention, right? And then he has this scene where William Holden's talking to him about breaking out, and he says, we're not going to break out. Like the Brits are not going to do that. And everyone's like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, it's our duty as British officers to try to sabotage the enemy. And if we have a means of escape, to try to take it. And he said, well, we were ordered to surrender. And so for us to escape may mean that we're actually breaking our own orders and therefore breaking the law. And the idea of breaking the letter of the law is so abhorrent to him that like that's what's driving him, not common sense. And so you see it in his character from the very, very beginning. And I think you don't, like the British officers in the movie, you don't question it at first until it just stops making sense completely.
Yeah, man. For me, the point where I realized that he was crazy was when he made his officers work. Like, that's the moment where you're like, oh, he wasn't ever really fighting for his officers. He was fighting for his own vision of how things should be done.
Yeah.
And now that his own vision of how things should be done include his officers working, he's totally fine with having his officers work. And I think that that's like the sign of someone who's unstable, who state their desires of how they want to be treated and how people should be treated and how they think the world should work. And then they flip all those things on a dime as soon as it doesn't fit their needs anymore. And I think that's like the key element of someone who is unstable.
Well, and that's the brilliant thing about the depiction of the Japanese officers of the camp too here. And I do want to touch on the actor Sesue Hayakawa, who plays Saito, because I think he's phenomenal. And I guess in real life, David Lean said that he thought that the actor was starting to have some form of dementia, and he didn't remember a lot of the English that he'd apparently learned earlier in his career as an actor. And so he only really studied the pages of the script that he had to memorize lines for. And so even in the scene where he gets killed at the end of the movie, where he gets stabbed to death, David Lean said he just kind of like stood there blankly because he didn't read that page of the script because he didn't have any lines in it. So like, I honestly, for getting that much crap from David Lean, I really thought his performance was excellent. It was super layered. It really did a great job of hammering home this idea of shame in that culture. And I also think that, last week before I had watched the movie, I mentioned that David Lean was incriminating or interrogating, I guess, the British sensibility in this movie by the fact that the Japanese basically gaslight the British officers into building the bridge under their own accord and use their own Britishness against them. And that's not actually what happens in this movie at all. Like, by the time Alec Guinness kind of takes up the mantle and goes off into his own delusions, you realize that Saito is completely defeated and he takes no joy in what's going on. And he just kind of turns the reins over to the Brits to like let them construct the bridge. And he's like a shell of himself at that point. And I think it gets back to this idea of the madness of war, that ultimately Saito gets everything he wanted at the beginning of the movie. But he is now so clouded over with the shame of it all and the fact that he didn't do it the way he was supposed to get it done, that he also takes no enjoyment in it.
Yeah, it's an incredible performance. I thought it was most fascinating to watch the battle of wills between the two of them and the moment where the tables turn and Alec Guinness realizes he has the power. And it feels like it's when he has him over for dinner. And the moment Saito starts showing anger, it's like Alec Guinness knows he's won.
Yeah.
He's like, my politeness has won out because you are getting angry. And if you are showing emotion, that means you've lost. And that little piece of acting in that scene between the two of them, which is just a really simple scene of the two of them having a dinner together, Saito thinking he has the upper hand, but betraying himself eventually. And Alec Guinness basically offers him the solution, which Saito takes, which emasculates him.
Yeah.
And it's just, I mean, that's a point where I think that the script and the acting work together so perfectly to display this psychological warfare.
Well, and the brilliant thing about that scene too, first of all, it's the way that they use like the utensils and everything else on the table. You know, Saito thinks he's going to get in his head by drinking scotch and eating corned beef. And Alec Guinness says, I don't want any. And he pours scotch for him and Alec Guinness won't drink it because he literally just came out of torture. And as soon as Alec Guinness is like, I have the upper hand, he starts pounding the scotch, dude. He's like, I got it now, right? But I think the thing about that scene, and it really is the hinge point of the movie, is that you think that the two are going to kind of take opposite trajectories, right? That we've seen Saito's rise and now we're going to see his fall. And we saw the downfall of Alec Guinness and now we're going to see him rise. And it's not that at all. It's just that like Alec Guinness is going to follow the exact same trajectory. It's just delayed by a couple hours. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
you see him get the upper hand and then immediately in his own hubris, he starts to put together this plan for like the British way of doing it. Now that he's won, he's like, all right, I'm going to build this bridge now because I'm doing it my way. Not realizing he's still doing exactly what he was never supposed to do. So, yeah, man, we could go on talking about this forever, but we need to drink some whiskey. So what do you say we hit pause here? Let's try this Jameson Cold Brew. What do you say?
Let's get to it.
All right, today we are checking out Jameson Cold Brew. Now, Brad, this was a sample that was sent to us by a listener way back in like season 2 or season 3. We've been hanging on to this sample forever. And it's kind of because we've been hemming and hawing about whether or not to actually feature it on the show, because it is not technically a whiskey for whiskey purists. I'll say that. Like, I don't know if I would consider this a flavored whiskey, but we had something similar to this a while back from the Few company out of Chicago. They had a product called Cold Cut where they brought their bourbon down to proof with cold brew coffee. And this is kind of similar. I don't think they're actually proofing this down with coffee, but they're in their words, infusing Jameson with Arabica beans. And so it produces what is essentially a liqueur, if I'm being honest. Like I don't want to call it a flavored whiskey, but it's also only 30% ABV. So it's 60 proof. It doesn't really reach the 80 proof level that we would designate whiskey as. So this is kind of a first for us on the Film and Whiskey podcast. Like, we've had a couple of flavored whiskeys before, but we've always done them on bonus episodes. But I'll say this, like when I go to the liquor store and I go to the Irish whiskey section, they've got this next to Jameson on the shelf. So it's like, it's in the liquor store. It's not over with like the mixers and the Aperol and all that stuff. So I don't know, man. What do you call this? Is this a whiskey? Is this a liqueur? Like where are we going with this?
I'm just going to say that it's not very good.
So you've had it already.
I sure have, Bob.
Okay. I tried it just before we hit record. I have a slightly different opinion than you, but I felt like it was necessary for us to at least preface the review by saying we're gonna
100%.
We're gonna review it as if it is a whiskey, but at the end of the day, it's more akin to like Fireball than it is to regular Jameson.
Yeah, and I'll point this out on my notes as well. This tastes a lot like coffee with a tiny bit of whiskey in it.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem that I have with this whiskey is mostly the fact that I know what kind of coffee I like, and I don't like this coffee.
No, it tastes like Maxwell House or like Folger. Like it tastes like coffee that comes in a tin.
Exactly. And so that is the biggest frustration. If they made this and it had a better coffee flavor to it, I would probably like it. That's the struggle I have with this.
It doesn't really taste like an Irish coffee. Like it doesn't taste like coffee liqueur or like a cream, like an Irish cream. Like it tastes like coffee that is just slightly artificially sweetened. So it has that kind of coffee syrup flavor. It's really hard to explain. Let's dive in, man. So I poured this out into my Glencairn. On the nose of this, it doesn't smell like coffee. It smells kind of musty. And after a while, I settled on, it smells like if you took decaf coffee that comes in a can and is pre-ground, opened it and left the lid off of it for like 3 days. Like there's like all of the potency of ground coffee is gone out of this. And all of the little bits of decaf coffee that smell like wet cardboard, that's what stayed behind. And like just the faintest memory of coffee.
A memory of coffee. It's a painting by Robert Book.
The LaCroix of ground coffee.
Oh, man. Yeah, for me on the nose, it initially smelled like nail polish remover.
Ooh.
Which gets me really excited about my whiskey. I was just super jazzed. Eventually, it kind of came out to like a super dark roast coffee. And I literally just wrote this. I like coffee, but I don't like this. I give it a 4 out of 10 on the nose, Bob.
Yeah, I was thinking about giving it a 5. I gave it a 6 out of 10 because it wasn't that bad to me. I didn't get nail polish remover at all, which is a good thing. So I'm at a 6. When it gets to the taste, I actually thought the taste was quite nice. Like I'm going to be pretty far off from you on this one, Brad, I think, except that it's all coffee, no whiskey. Like there's just the slightest little alcohol burn on the end of this. It's like if you went out to a really cheap restaurant like an Applebee's or something and asked them for like a rum and Coke and they gave you like an ounce or a half ounce of rum and then filled like the whole pint glass up with Coke after that and you just barely get a wisp of rum. That's kind of how this is to me. Like it tastes like really strong fake coffee syrup mixed with really bad Folgers coffee. And like just a touch of alcohol in the end. Yeah. Now here's the thing. Here's the thing. Like I still don't think it's bad. It's not as cloyingly sweet as something like Fireball or a lot of these flavored whiskeys we've had. I think it's definitely more sippable and it probably mixes really well with a lot of things. And I think it probably would dilute well. It wouldn't taste just like straight artificial sweetener. So based on that curve, I'm going to give it a 6.5 on the taste. But again, like we're not judging this based on like its whiskey characteristics.
Right. And that's the hard thing. It's a difficult one to score. For me, I came out to a 5 out of 10 on the flavor. It just tastes like coffee that was brewed about 4 or 5 hours ago. Like it's lost its potency. The dark notes have overtaken any sort of flavor that should have been there. And there's a hint of whiskey on the end. It's not bad, but it's not enjoyable for me. So, 5 out of 10. And the finish for me is where this really struggles the most. Mostly because it tastes like the finish of a coffee that was brewed 4 or 5 hours ago. That is to say bitter and unfulfilling.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a complex drink. Like the notes are the same throughout. And I guess that we can attribute that to the balance here. But on the finish, I just wrote, the finish is black coffee, but cheap. Yep. That's pretty much it. I gave it a 6.5. Listen, I've had many, many, many cups of crappy coffee in my life. And this is like a slightly more pleasant version of that.
Yeah, I gave it a 3 out of 10 on the finish.
So you really hated this?
I was not a fan.
Huh. Yeah, I didn't mind it that much. It's definitely nowhere, like the Few Cold Cut is leagues better than this.
Yes.
But I also feel like the Few Cold Cut is a whiskey. And I feel like this is a cordial.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
No, 100%. I mean, I gave it a 7 on balance.
I did
because
too.
It is the same experience throughout. It's not complex. It's not enjoyable. That's why I didn't get anything higher. But like they knocked it out of the park in giving you the experience of coffee.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, I gave it a 7 as well. And that brings us to the value of this thing, which, I think we're going to have to judge it against both the whiskeys that it sits next to on the shelf and the liqueurs and cordials that it sits across the aisle from. So what does this retail for in the state of Ohio, Brad?
$28.99.
Yeah, that's too much. If this was $18, I'd be like, cool.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, this costs pretty much as much as a bottle of Jameson, which is outrageous. Like, buy Jameson, and if you want to add coffee to it, add coffee to it. Like, what are you doing? $28. Yep. Yeah, this is a 3 out of 10 on value.
Yeah, I gave it a 4. Like, if you know what you're getting into, like, sure, go for it. But, I came to a 23 out of 50, Bob. Where are you at?
I'm at a 29 out of 50. So that brings us to a 52 out of 100 or a 26 out of 50. I think it goes without saying, neither of us are going to recommend this. I actually don't mind it for what it is. It sounds like Brad does mind it for what it is. But this is not, again, we're not trying to be like whiskey snobs or whiskey purists here, but this is not really a whiskey. I would have to venture to say that I think that there's probably something artificial in here. I don't really see anything about that online, so maybe it's just a note that I'm getting, but it definitely tastes like they've sweetened this a little bit. And you know what? If they have, cool. Like, it'll make a cool mixed drink. But it feels more like we're reviewing a bottle of Kahlua than we're reviewing a whiskey this week.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is definitely not me being a whiskey snob. It is me being a coffee snob, and I'm A-okay with that.
All right, man. So we're not recommending Jameson Cold Brew, but we are recommending Bridge on the River Kwai. So why don't we get back into talking about this movie?
I am excited to get away from this whiskey, Bob. All right, everybody. That was Jameson Cold Brew, a whiskey that wasn't a whiskey, but was kind of a whiskey that tasted like coffee.
Boom.
Boom. 2 Facts and a Falsehood is much better than Jameson Cold Brew. So how about we do that, Bob?
Yeah, why don't you explain to the listeners, Brad, what is 2 Facts and a Falsehood and why am I so good at it?
This is Canada's favorite segment, Bob. It's where I try to lie to you, and you have to pick out my lie. The lie is related to the movie that we just watched. You get 2 facts about the movie as drawn from the IMDb trivia page, assuming that those are all true.
Yeah, important note.
Yes, 100%. If those are lies, then I will take the L there. So far, it seems like we've done pretty good with the truths. And then I just make up a lie, which is kind of hard to do, surprisingly.
All right, so Brad has 3 items for me, one of which is a falsehood. Why don't you reveal your 3 tidbits?
Fact number 1. Sir Laurence Olivier was offered the part of Colonel Nicholson, but turned it down in order to direct The Prince and the Showgirl instead. Fact number 2. Thailand was originally chosen as the location for the shoot, but the country was pressured by the USSR against allowing the film to be shot there, forcing Horizon Pictures to find another country, which ended up being Sri Lanka. Fact number 3, for the scenes where Holden and Hawkins and Horn were wading through the swamp, they were wading through specially created ones. The real swamps in Sri Lanka were deemed to be too dangerous.
Interesting. All right. I'm pretty sure number 2 is a truth. I know they shot in Sri Lanka, so I'm going to go ahead and assume that the earlier part of that fact is also true. Number 3 is interesting to me. I know they spent like 250 shooting days on this movie in the jungle, and that Lean was a really huge perfectionist and would wait on shots to develop at just the right time. So I do have a hard time thinking that he would specially create things for this movie unless it was absolutely necessary. Fact number 1 is also interesting because I mentioned Olivier earlier in the episode. I know that David Lean actually wanted Charles Laughton to play Nicholson at one point. And I don't know if you're familiar with Charles Laughton, Brad, but he had to be like in his mid-50s at least at this point. And he was very overweight. So like the studio was like, absolutely not. And that's how they settled on Alec Guinness. I don't know if Olivier was ever considered. So I'm going to say 3 is also true. And I'm going to say 1 is the falsehood. And I don't feel super confident about that, but that's my final answer.
Bob, you are 100% wrong.
No!
Yeah.
No! Again?
Olivia,
dude, I'm on a losing streak. This is bad.
You've been a streaky one this year, Bob.
This is like 3 or 4 in a row.
Yeah. Olivier said in retrospect that it was a sensible decision to go off and do love scenes with Marilyn Monroe rather than tough it out in the jungles of Ceylon with David Lean.
I mean, he's not wrong.
The swamps were actually created because the swamps in Sri Lanka were too dangerous. The falsehood was that Thailand was originally chosen as a location for the shoot.
Oh, interesting. They did film in Sri Lanka. I knew that.
They did film in Sri Lanka. That was true.
But they never.
But the whole idea
Thailand.
of the USSR pressuring and all that's all fake.
Yeah, all right. If only I knew my geopolitical history better.
Well, I was going to say I chose Thailand partially because that's where the River Kwai is, and also because they were a somewhat ally of the USSR in the Cold War.
Oh, cool. All right. Yeah. I just kind of assumed that you were right because I know absolutely nothing about Thailand. So
nailed it.
There you go. Nice job, man. Nicely done.
Thanks, dude.
All right, man, let's talk a little bit about David Lean and our impressions of him so far, because next week we are going to take a very hard turn into a film of his from the 1940s that was made on a much smaller budget. That's an adaptation of a play by the famous playwright Noel Coward. It's nothing like this, right? And so you've got him here in like action hero mode. Last week you have him in like meditative, I don't know what the word is, visual splendor. And next week, we're getting him in a kind of a domestic drama. And so I think that our impressions of Lean after next week might be very different than our impressions of him today after these 2 movies. So like, so far, Brad, what do you think of our boy David Lean?
I think he's a fascinating director. I think that he really is a very early example of a popular director who is kind of subverting the public's expectation of what they are going to see at the film or at the movies. Like you're set up as this POW movie that, it's the Pacific version of The Great Escape. Like, and I'm not saying that they advertise it that way, but I'm sure somebody thought of it in that sense. And yet you have this really deep psychological drama. And so I think with Lean, he pairs beautiful cinematography with really fascinating character dives and scripts that just take you in very unexpected directions. And so he blends the 3 of those things together in a really beautiful way. So I really like him so far. I think the final shot of this movie, right after the medic has declared madness, it shows him standing by the dead bodies of our madmen, and the camera just slowly pans out, and you just see this destroyed bridge and these dead bodies, and it's a visual depiction of what the medic just declared, madness. Like, what the hell was the point of everything we just did in this movie? And then, to top it all off, he plays just the most triumphant British marching music. And it's just, I just think he wants to subvert people's expectations of what they're going to the movies to see. And it's great.
Yeah, I wasn't prepared for the extent to which he really does kind of like indict his own Britishness in these movies and call into question themes of like colonialism and honor and war. And like, there's so many layers going on to these movies. You know, we didn't touch on this in the earlier part of the episode, but the guy that plays the medic in this movie was also in The Great Escape. And so I think that's part of the reason why I tie the two together so much, because I'm used to seeing that guy's face in both movies. And I love The Great Escape. I think that I gave that movie a 9.5 because it is like, you know, there are moments of drama in that movie and it is very moving at parts, but it's a popcorn movie. Like, it's a fun movie. It's about as fun of a movie as you could possibly make about a prisoner of war camp, right? This movie, you feel the more punishing aspects of it. Like the torture scenes are torturous and pretty gruesome and violent for 1957.
Mm-hmm.
They get away with a lot in this movie. And he's just, from the get-go, he's just dealing with themes that are on a much more difficult plane than something like The Great Escape. And I respect the hell out of it because this movie has a lot more to say than The Great Escape. And at the same time, it is every bit as suspenseful. It's every bit as entertaining. Like, he makes a movie that you could go in and watch strictly as a popcorn movie, and it works like gangbusters. And then when you want to start peeling back the layers of the onion, there's a hell of a lot to peel.
Yeah, I think that Ebert kind of says it best, as he usually does. He says that most movies are either for or against their wars. By the end of Kwai, we are less interested in who wins than in how the individual characters will behave. And I think that kind of sums it up for me, that like this movie doesn't necessarily end up saying anything about the war, but it has everything to say about British culture and Japanese culture and how much more similar they are than you'd like to think that they are, and how individuals will behave with this society hanging above them.
Hey, while we're talking about super serious things, can I pivot to something that I found absolutely hilarious? So,
why, yes, you can.
The song that they whistle very famously in this movie, Colonel Bogey March, which came up again in The Breakfast Club, 30 years later almost. In World War II, because this was a World War I song that the soldiers would whistle and sing in World War II to pass the time, and they devised some very spicy lyrics to it to just kind of stick it to the Germans. And so in this movie, David Lean has them whistling that tune because he knows that the Brits in the audience will know exactly what the dirty lyrics were to this song. And, they couldn't say it, so they just had them whistle it so they could sneak it by the censors. But Brad, because I am a fan of the lyrics of this song, I'm going to read them out loud right now.
I am very excited for this.
To stick it to the Germans. This is what they would sing. And I won't sing it, but I'll just say it to the rhythm. They said, Hitler has only one right ball. Goering has two, but they are small. Himmler has something similar, but Goebbels has no balls at all. And that's what they would sing about the Germans. I love it, dude.
That is incredible. I never expected to get a great little bit of Nazi hate in our Pacific setting. That is just beautiful. Good job, David Lean.
All right, man. I think we have said about all there is to say about this movie. It's time for us to segue into our final segment, which we call Make It a Double, where we pick a movie to make a double feature with this. Brad, I've been talking about The Great Escape all day. I think that's maybe the most obvious movie to watch with this, except for perhaps Stalag 17, which is that Billy Wilder movie with William Holden as the leader of an outbreak of a prisoner of war camp. As the leader of the cast, and it's a movie about a prisoner of war camp. So I'm going to take the easy way out. I'll say go watch Stalag 17 because we haven't reviewed that on the podcast yet, and it's Billy Wilder. Like, it's a great movie. So I'm going to make this a double. We'll do a William Holden double feature today.
For me, Bob, I'm going to go vastly in a different direction. I am going to pair this movie with Fight Club.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What's the connection here?
I feel like a lot of people would watch this movie and just go, huh, cool war movie. They blew up a bridge. Awesome. Mm-hmm. And I feel like a lot of people watch Fight Club and be like, yeah, rule number 1, you don't talk about Fight Club. That like we're going to start a Fight Club. We're manly. And I feel like both Lean and Fincher have an ability in these two movies to write a movie that goes over the head of a lot of people that watch it. And I just appreciate that. I just think that there's so much to be said for movies that are really smart. Mm-hmm. And this is a really smart movie, Bob. And I think that Fight Club is a really smart movie. So I'm going to pair Fight Club with The Bridge on the River Kwai.
I like that, man. Yeah, nice choice. I don't like Fight Club, but I respect.
I was about to say.
I would pair Fight Club with Jameson Cold Brew. That's what I would do.
Yeah. Ooh, yeah.
All right, man. Let's give this movie some scores. And, I'll start. Last week, I said that I was going to give this either an equivalent or a higher score than Lawrence of Arabia, with the caveat that I understand Lawrence of Arabia, cinematic masterpiece. I enjoy this movie more than Lawrence of Arabia. I'm going to watch this movie more times in my life than I watch Lawrence of Arabia. It is the perfect example of taking a movie, like just an entertaining movie, and elevating it to a work of art. And I don't think it's perfect. Like you said, they could probably trim 15 minutes out of that William Holden cutaway sequence. So I'm going to give it a 9.5 out of 10, but this is like about as good as a 9.5 can get without being a 10.
Yeah. I'm going to give it a 9.5 as well, Bob. I think that this movie is incredible. It moves at such a nice pace for a long movie. You get everything you need out of Alec Guinness's performance. There's just so much to love here, man.
All right, so that's it from us. We are giving this a 9.5 out of 10, but we'd like to know what you think. And honestly, please write us on Discord, write us on our social media accounts. We want to know if you've seen this movie, because it seems like a hell of a lot of people have seen this movie, but I never hear anybody talk about it. So what's your experience with Bridge on the River Kwai? We would love to have you reach out to us on our social media accounts, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, @FilmWhiskey.
Or, as Bob said, you can jump on our Discord. We're on there every single day talking to you guys, the people who listen to our podcast. So if you want to join the conversation, hit up the link at the end of every one of our show notes.
Next week, we're going to finish out our David Lean miniseries with a movie that none of you have seen, but all of you should see, 1945's Brief Encounter. We'll be back with that one next Monday, but until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.